All right. Good afternoon. This week we're talking about really two topics. We're covering one chapter, chapter 14, but it covers family and religion, which both are pretty, pretty big, important topics. But you only have so much room and so many chapters in a textbook before you run out of semester, right? And so the author has decided to combine these together, right? Uh, where to begin? Well, I guess we could start with family, right? And that's the order it's presented in the chapter. And we could talk about like what does family mean and what is its significance for our society? What is it significant for other societies, other cultures, and how is it defined, right? And I'm bringing up my notes. So family it's one of those five great social institutions that we talked about at the beginning of this class, right? And it's arguably the most important. I mean, it is the most important, right? I won't water down that claim. It is the most important. It is a cultural universal. No culture has ever existed without families, none present or in the distant past, right? And that tells you a number of things, right? How important it is, how social life is really pretty much impossible without it, right? And we've talked about socialization, how that's where a lot of primary socialization takes place. It's also where we learn language, symbolic communication. It's where social control begins, right? So a lot of important things are going on with families, right? What we mean by the word family has changed over time, right? So family is defined as a social institution found in all societies that unites people in cooperative groups, right? Or at least should be cooperative to take care of one another, especially children, right? So it is the place where traditionally children are born, not always, right? But at least there's that expectation that children will be born of a married couple in matrimony, right? And they will be raised in that institution of family, right? Now, how this word changes over time, here's the most important, right? Most of the time when we say family, you're probably thinking of my kids and my wife, and you've seen them interrupt us many times, right? I don't know if you see my wife in the background of these videos, but that's really nuclear family, right? Sometimes there's two parents, sometimes there's one parent, and there's one or more kids, right? That's what typically we mean when we say the word family. But 100 years ago, we would have meant something different, kind of an extended family. In that extended family, might have lived in our same house, right? Where you'd have multiple generations living in the same house, grandparents and stuff like that. And then right outside the house, maybe your neighbors would be aunts and uncles and things of that sort, right? Now, the extended family is not as important as it used to be, right? We don't see our extended family as often. When I think about my extended family, they're all over the country, and I used to see them every year at a family reunion, but we hadn't had a family reunion in a number of years, right? And a lot of that is the distance, right? And I had some extended family that lived close and cousins that I grew up with and was very close. But even those people later in my life, I've lost contact with. Not complete contact, but maybe a year or two will pass and I won't talk to them, right? And then just, happy birthday and stuff like that, right? So that's the first really big change in family, is the decline of the extended family, right? And, that starts happening certainly post World War II. That trend's very much on its way, right? And a number of things that we've talked about before, like industrialization, and people, go where their jobs are, and that kind of determines where they live, and migration, and people getting educated, college degrees, and usually after you do that, you don't move back home, you move to a big city where the jobs are and stuff like that. So there are all sorts of trends that kind of determine the declining influence of the extended family. Now, you might be an exception, right? And there are exceptions. There are some people that I know that kind of still live in a family compound of extended, family and stuff. But that's, and if you do live in one of those, you probably recognize that it's fairly rare and not typical at all. All right? So we talked about extended family, nuclear family. So a little bit about marriage patterns. We've already talked about homogamy at the very beginning of this class, right? This tendency for people to marry other people that are similar in all sorts of different ways, right? Like, I always think of me and my wife, right? Similar educational backgrounds. Our parents had similar class positions. We're both white. We're both Christian, right? And so marriage tends to be between people in the same social category, whether it's class, race. Of course, gender is an exception, right? And that's what we call an endogamy, right? Exogamy is marriage between people of different categories, different races, different class, different religions, different castes, if you're talking about a country like India or something like that. And that's more rare, right? People do, I don't know if you ever heard of like marry someone in a social category above theirs. That does happen occasionally, but most time it's fairly even between people, right? Now a lot of these, the study of family and stuff comes from, there is the sociology of family, but there's also the anthropology of family. And I do want to point out some kind of exogamous marriage partners. There's a number of, hunting and gathering societies where they never marry someone within their clan. They always marry someone in like an adjoining territory, right? That's kind of example of exogamy being much more common. Of course, in our country, right, marriage is typically monogamous, two partners, right? But there have been parts of the United States, and continue to be some parts, where polygamy is practiced, right? No longer legally, right? And there are other countries, right? They tend to be countries that are kind of less industrialized, that are closer to agrarian, because polygamy is much more common. Even if you think about it appearing in the Bible and stuff like that, those are kind of agrarian or pastoral horticulture, right? A lot of countries in Africa, right? Some Middle Eastern countries still practice polygamy, of course. In Utah at one time they did, the Mormon Church, and that's kind of one of the, but they no longer do. But there are Reformed Mormon churches that still do, although it's against the law, right? And there's, documentaries and reality TV shows and, was it Sister Wives and stuff like that, that you might be aware of, right? But typically the expectation is that when someone gets married in the United States, a man and a woman, now, of course, that can be a man and a man, and a woman and a woman, right? But still two people, right? Still two people, right? Yeah. We already kind of talked about residential patterns. When two people get married, are they going to live closer to the husband's family or the wife's family? You know what? I live closer to my wife's family and stuff. Now, some of that job happens to be in the same place, but I look for a job. I look for a job in the place my wife wanted to move to as well. But that's the difference between patrilocality and matrilocality, right? Typically, it's more common that people will move closer to the husband's family, right? And less common that the man will live closer to the wife's husband. That's, yeah. Yeah, increasingly though, you get this, like, you don't live near either one. And most of my life, like, I hadn't, me and my wife, when we were married, we didn't live really very close to either one of our parents. So that's kind of the new, right? Because jobs kind of determine where you live increasingly, right? So you get this pattern of neo-locality, right? All right. I guess we could go ahead and talk a little bit about the different theoretical approaches and how they view, right? So typically we always kind of start with structural functionalism. Like we already said, it's cultural universal. That's the theme that structural functionalists always look for. And when they find one, it's, it must provide some really important function for society. Otherwise, I'll move the camera here a little bit. Otherwise, you wouldn't see it present, right, in all known cultures, past and present, right? So what are those important functions, right? Some of these already mentioned, where socialization, particularly primary socialization, takes place. Some secondary socialization. It also, this might seem a little bit strange, but it is also where families regulate sexual activity, right? Most families, it's completely acceptable for husband and wife, but not other people, right? And those are what we call incest taboos. I think we already talked about taboos, and you're not even supposed to talk about these without people sanctioning you, right? But incest taboos are they're a cultural universal too. Every society has now, how they define it, how far incest taboos extend out to cousins or nuclear family, that does vary, right? And incest taboos are broken, right? One of my first jobs was working for the Department of Human Resources, and one of the disturbing things that I found at that job is incest is much more common than most people expect. Yeah. And that's it's important for a number of reasons, but not all families are successful at regulating the sexual activity of people, right? That's when I was, probably my mid-20s, I had that job, and it's very, very disturbing to me to have cases that involved incest, right? I mean, incredibly disturbing. Like, I can't sleep at night and stuff like that. Yeah. The next function yeah, of course, like, so these incest taboo norms forbidding sexual relations or marriage between, um, you know, certain relatives and stuff like that. That is all, their society allows some people to have sex with each other under certain conditions. It doesn't allow other people, right? And that type of social control is very important, right? Now, a lot of times when people think about incest, they think, oh, this is, it's going to, the first thing they think about is going to create birth defects. And there's some risk to that, right? But it also would make family life chaotic and unpredictable, right? If parents have sex, and forgive me for talking about an incest taboo, with their kids and they have offspring, and and just everyone, sexual activity within the family is not controlled, then you could have a kid that's an uncle, and it's just like a kid that's an aunt, but also a child, and it just, people wouldn't know how to treat each other because they would have multiple roles, right? And that's a big part of why families have always controlled. And also, if everyone satisfied sexual desires in an uncontrolled way, it would arouse all sorts of conflict and jealousy and violence and stuff like that, right? So in order for families to function, they have to regulate sexual behavior, right? Or the family would be torn apart in a million different directions, right? Families also are involved in kind of social placement, right? So when we're young, particularly when you're like a college student and stuff like that, you're probably not making much money, right? But we don't typically ask college students what their class position is. Instead, we ask them, what is your parents' class position? Because in a lot of ways, we kind of inherit that, right? Yeah. Certainly for adolescents and stuff like that, you would ask, how much your parents made, not how much you made, right? You might make so little that you're living in poverty, but if you have parents that have higher incomes and wealth and stuff like that, you're not really living in poverty, right? And then also families provide material and emotional security, right? If you get yourself in trouble, if you have times of scarcity, right? You lean upon your family. If you can't feed yourself, you go to your family. You can't clothe yourself, you go to your family, right? If you can't pay your bills, you go to your family, right? And you also go there for emotional security, right? Shoulder to cry upon, right? And emotional support as well, right? And all of those are the important functions of a family, right? And if you've ever had someone that did not have a family, that was orphaned or something like that, you know how challenging that is for them, right? Yeah. We move on, kind of social conflict theories, particular feminist theories, right? Our families are, we live in a patriarchy. Our society is patriarchal. Our families are as well. Not as much as they used to be, right? So it used to be 1950s, you had male as a breadwinner and mom probably stayed at home and stuff like that. And there was a strict division of labor in the household and outside of the household. Not really anymore. There's some families are still like that, right? But in my household, where I like to think me and my wife are equals, right? We both work, right? We both do household chores. Now, both of us always think that we're doing more than half of household chores. But, I load the dishwasher. She does the laundry, I vacuum and stuff like that, right? Yeah, and that's fine, Now, people from the 1950s, or people like my dad, like, I never saw my dad do any household chores like that, and probably his grandfather is even less likely to do household chores, and you know, his mother, didn't work, and that's kind of traditional gender roles, right? Of kind of the breadwinner and the homemaker and stuff like that. But we don't see that as much as we used to, right? And a lot of that is because of the difficulty of the economy, right? Every once in a while I'll joke with my wife about like, I'm going to be the breadwinner and you're going to quit your job and stay home. And I'm totally joking about that because we're not going to be able to pay all the bills if my wife, right? And so that's a change in the economy, right? I mean, back in the 1940s and 50s, things were really nice. They were so nice that one man, I mean, maybe it wasn't as nice for everyone, but you could have one breadwinner and that could pay for everyone and more kids than we have now, right? The economy's not like that anymore, right? I do know some people whose wives stay at home, but yeah, they make a lot of money. Or sometimes they have religious beliefs that that factor into that, right? Kind of impossible in my household for one of us to quit our jobs, right? And yeah. All right. Yeah, so because we live in a patriarchy and our families tend to be a reflection of this patriarchal society, it's like families perpetuate gender inequality, right? In a number of ways, right? Typically, the men, the boys, inherit more of the wealth of the family than the women, right? Traditionally, that was certainly the case, right? That's primogeniture, is what they call that, right? Where even as like the firstborn male, right? And the girls will get nothing, right? Yeah, patriarchy, it perpetuates gender stratification, right? And endogamous marriage perpetuates racial and ethnic. If we have more exogenous, you would see people moving up and down when they got married, right? And kids of those families would have greater social mobility as well, right? So that's kind of the social conflict analysis, right? Talk a little bit about the experience. Yeah, I don't know. Before in this class, we've talked about ideal and real marriage. There's the expectations, and then there's reality, right? I think early in this class, it's like an ideal culture. All my students would read every chapter, right? Reality is, I know that a lot of you don't get around to it, right? But there is that expectation, right? And marriage can be like this as well, particularly infidelity or sex outside. I'm certainly not talking about my marriage, right? But there's the expectation that people don't have sexual relations outside of those bonds of matrimony, right? But at the same time, all of us know people that violate those expectations, men and women, right? So that's kind of, there's the expectation, but then there's reality, right? And, of course, a lot of families, a lot of marriages, including mine, know infidelity that I know of, right? I'm certain there's no infidelity, right? But I do want to kind of point that out, right? And yeah. Talk a little bit about child rearing. Increasingly, kids don't stay at home very long, right? So I mean, me and my wife worked, and she needed to get back to work. I needed to get back to work, so I missed very few days of work, and she did too. And it is a difficult and strange thing to have a very small infant and drop them off at daycare with people that you don't really know very well and say, take care of this completely helpless small child. I have to go to work for the next 8 hours, right? Like I knew that happened, but like when you do it with your kid, it like, wow, this just doesn't seem right. And of course, that's not the way that we've done it for most of the history, right? We'd probably leave the kid, if we had to go back to work, we'd probably leave the kid with a grandmother. That's very different than daycare, right? So increasingly, child rearing has changed, and most of this is because, industrialization. We have to have work, and we have to have two breadwinners in the family and stuff, and we can't be out of work, right? Now there are other societies, advanced post-industrial societies, that a lot of Scandinavian countries, right? Finland, Norway, and stuff. They allow parents to stay home for 2 years, and they give them a paycheck to do that, right? Be nice, wouldn't it? Yeah, and families and marriages would be much better and much stronger and less divorce, and kids would be brought up and be much healthier too. But we don't have a generous welfare state, right? Like most Scandinavian countries. But it is possible, right? Yeah, we've talked about declining fertility and how, most families now have one or two people, right? One or two children, right? Used to be much bigger. Why is that? Well, because no one can afford to have any more than that, right? A lot of people can't afford the ones that they have, right? And there came a time, in my relationship with my wife where, I thought I wanted another kid, and my wife did not want to have another kid. And when I started thinking about it, having to put 3 kids in daycare at the same time would have been a really, really difficult financially. 2 kids in daycare at the same time was financially very difficult, right? And most people, and then to put them through college later in their lives too, that's going to be strained. Now, I've been saving some up, but like kids are just, they're not, it's not like when we lived on farms in an agrarian society where you have more kids and they're an asset to the farm, the family economy, right? And they're more a liability. They don't pull their own weight. Sometimes well into their 20s, they don't pull their own weight. So most of the money is going from the parents to the kids, right? And it's split among the kids. So, if you want them to have all the things that parents want them to have, cars, college degrees, health care, and stuff like that, it makes sense to kind of limit the number of children that you have, right? Yeah. A little bit about divorce, right? Long term, divorce is much more common than it used to be, right? But it's not like 1970s, right? I grew up in 1970s, right? And it seemed to me that all of my friends' parents got a divorce except for mine, right? And that's because in the 1970s, divorce was kind of at its peak, right? And sociologists, because the family is so important, that's not really a good thing. Although it's not really a good thing for people to stay in marriages if they're miserable or if they're being abused or exploited or something like that, right? Or if they fight all the time in front of the kids, particularly, right? So sociologists have been sounding the alarms about divorce rates, right? And they are much higher than they used to be, right? But I can tell you, like, the things that people used to, particularly women, would tolerate within marriage, women used to tolerate being abused physically, sexually, denigrated, talked to in a certain way, and stuff like that. And nowadays, a lot of women are not. That's a good thing. That's part of liberation. Women not being dependent upon men as they used to, right? But it also causes some problems, right? Just like I was talking about, like, having a family with two breadwinners versus one. If you have one, your chances of living in poverty and your kids' chance of living in poverty are much greater, right? If you look at the statistics on poverty, lots of children live in poverty, and lots of them have one parent in their household, and that parent is typically the female, right? There has been this feminization of poverty, right? Where it's most of the poor people are women and children, and that's a shame, right? So divorce is certainly much more common, but yeah, there's reasons to get divorced, and there's reasons not to stick it out, even if you think you're doing it for the kids, right? And but it is much more common than it used to be. And so that's one parent families. Another emerging trend, certainly probably familiar with this on college campuses, is that of cohabitation, right? Cohabitation is when you live with another person, romantic interest, but you're not married. And that's quite common in most college towns. And that used to be a practice like that was mostly confined to poorer people, right? But increasingly, that's common among college students, well-educated people. I know people my age that, for some reason or another, decide not to get married, but they live in the same household and they seem happy with each other and they expect to be with each other for a very long period of time. That's cohabitation. That's a new pattern of family formation without marriage. All right. Of course, there's really important stuff when it comes to gay and lesbian couples, right? And most of this, like, I don't know, over the last 20 years or so, there's been extreme changes, right? It used to be the case that some states allowed it and other states did not, right? Until 2015, and the Supreme Court finally decided upon this. And what they said is that that everyone, regardless of gender, has a right to marry, regardless of the gender of them or the gender of the person they want to marry, right? And that ended it. Now it's already ended in some states, but that ended in states like Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia and Louisiana and Florida, all the places that I've lived in the past, right? And that, I thought that was a great thing. A lot of other people did not agree with me, right? And, but that's the change. That's a significant change, right? There are some other kind of the declining influence of family. There are a lot of people who live alone or live with roommates, right? There are a lot of people that are single and will remain single, some their entire lives, right? Some maybe like me until they're like 40 years old, right? Never, my wife's younger than me by 5 years, but she's never been married before, so it's kind of, that family formation being put off in time, into your late 20s, your 30s, sometimes even your 40s. I realize I'm kind of an extreme example of this, but that becomes much more common, right? And it becomes more common among upper class and educated professionals, right? Because they want to finish college first, and it's not just a bachelor's degree, it's a master's or PhD and stuff. In a lot of ways, it makes more sense because you're not making much money in graduate school to wait and then find someone. And that's exactly what I did after I got a PhD. I started to look to settle down. I wasn't alone all those times. I was dating and in committed relationships and stuff, but I wasn't really interested in getting married. I was or staying with that person for the rest of my life until I met my wife. Yeah. All right. There is kind of an epidemic of loneliness too, right? One of the things, oh boy, in the chapter on sex and gender, there are a lot of lonely people, right? And if you don't have a family, you're going to be a lot more lonely, right? You can have friends and stuff like that, but increasingly in today's society, we don't have a whole lot of relationships outside of work, right? We interact with people, and we have Facebook friends or whatever, social media and stuff. That's no substitute for the real thing, right? And there is a lot of young people that don't have romantic relationships. They engage in hooking up culture, right? But not in something more like courting or something, preparing yourself, dating in preparation for marriage or cohabitation or something like that, right? That's the kind of new trend, right? That people will hook up, have sexual activity, and have no expectation for even a long-term relationship, much less marriage and family and stuff like that, right? And I think that's the most common pattern of sexual behavior among a lot of college-age students, teenagers, 20s, 30s, right? Yeah, and that's a profound change, right? The profound change, and there are a lot of lonely people, and as a sociologist, like, everything of value in this world is about relationships. The things that matter the most to me: relationships with other people, relationships with my wife, what meaning would life be without those relationships? Well, wouldn't have much meaning at all. I mean, I guess I'd have my hobbies and stuff like that, but as humans, we wake up every morning and we want something to motivate us, to keep us going, to give our life meaning and joy, right? And I can tell you, after living many, many years, single and then some married, it's like, man, you wake up and you have kids and stuff like that. There's the meaning of your life right before you in the form of a child, right? Make them happy and give them everything they need. And try to make your wife happy and give her everything she needs and stuff like that. And, a lot of my 20s and stuff like that, I was kind of struggling to find meaning in my life. Right? So family is this place where we often find, and maybe this is kind of where we'll segue into another search for meaning, and that's religion, right? I mean, these are kind of the more symbolic institutions, right? Um, and the family, like the holy bonds of matrimony and stuff like that. And, you know, the marriage as a ritual and the exchanging of vows and the ring and all of the symbolism in that, and much of it sacred symbolism, right? Those are, you know, for me, that was a profound moment that changed everything in my life, right? And then there are also rituals about having children, having them christened in church and stuff like that. And cutting the umbilical cord and stuff like that. And those, you know, as parents often say, some of the, you know, the best moments of my life when I look back, right? And we do tend to kind of imbue them as different, as sacred, set apart from mundane world, right? They have greater significance, right? And that's why religions provide the rituals, provide the meaning to these things, right? Now you can get married without, you know, having faith or having a religion or being a member of it, and plenty of people do, right? But most people see these as kind of sacred, right? So this is my segue into religion, right? Emil Durkheim, right? Like, so what is a religion, right? And this was, you know, a big topic of discussion during the Enlightenment, 1700s, 1800s. You know, there was this growing idea during those years that religion was just like superstitious and it would fade away as we advance with scientific knowledge. That's what we call secularization, right? And that has happened in a lot of European countries, that religion continued. But at no point has religion just disappeared, right? And that process of desecularization, declining influence of religion, that has not really occurred in the United States in the same way that it has in most of those Western European countries. The United States remains very religious, right? And you can measure it like how many people say that they believe, how many people go to a church, and we're the United States is an exception to desecularism. Excuse me, desecular. I'm getting my words mixed up. It is an exception to secularization. Pardon me. Yeah. We remain, so secularization, the process of converting something from religious to secular, right? Now, there are a lot of people that don't go to church, right? More than in the past, right? So there's evidence of secularization, but we kind of remain. It's not like people predicted in the 1800s that as science advances, these superstitious religions will just fade away and no longer have any significance. They're still with us, right? And they still have a huge effect upon people's lives and our worldview, how we view things, and what meaning we imbue in things, like the meaning of getting married and the meaning of a wedding ring and the meaning of children and stuff like that, right? Because I certainly see, I certainly believe that there was something that put me and my wife together, right? I could be wrong, right? I believe there's some meaning to me having fathered these children and raised them and stuff like that. I don't think that's just something of this world, right? I think has greater significance than that, right? Or, some people might say it's like, the work that God has for me to do in this world, right? That's imbuing it with religious meaning, right? Yeah, that the family is sacred, the marriage is sacred, that raising kids is sacred, right? And so Durkheim said, here's what religion, the definition of religion is, right? It's any system that divides the world up into sacred and profound, right? The sacred is stuff that's imbued with extra meaning, is set apart, is special, right? And then the mundane is the normal, ordinary life, right? Now, I've had many responsibilities in my life. Some of them are sacred. Most of them are profound, right? Yeah, most of them are profound. Excuse me, profane. I'm just mixing up all my words today, right? Most of them are profane, right? And so religion divides the world up. There's sacred objects and there's profane, mundane, everyday, ordinary life, right? And typically the first rule in any religion is the sacred and the profane should not be mixed together, contaminated, each other, things of that sort, right? Yeah. And the sacred objects must be treated in sacred ways, right? So, if you grew up a Christian like I did and stuff like that, one of our most sacred objects is the crucifix, right? And you don't treat it like a normal object, right? I mean, there are things that I do with a normal object, right? Throw it around, spill something like that. You don't do that with sacred objects, right? Not without some guilty feelings and, maybe a feeling that something bad might happen to you and maybe you might get sanctioned by other people and stuff like that, right? Yeah. And, so that's the difference between sacred and profound. Like, Emile Durkheim wrote this book called Elementary Forms of Religious Experience. And it's really this, he thought that you could go back to hunting and gathering societies, particularly those among Aborigines tribes in Australia, right? And you could study religion in that kind of primitive form, right? And it would teach us something about our own religion, right? Christianity, but also Judaism, because Emile Durkheim's father was a rabbi. He was Jewish, right? And he thought you could go back and you could kind of see the elementary forms of religious experience, right? And that would teach us kind of what Christianity was like at the very beginning of it, right? And Aborigines tribes, and I've read this book, it's an excellent book, right? But Aborigines tribes are typically named after an animal, and that is what they call their totem, right? So you have a group of people living in the desert in Australia, and they might be the frog totem or the salamander totem or the snake totem or the kangaroo totem or whatever, right? And that animal becomes a symbol for the society, for the culture, for the tribe, right? And that symbol is sacred, right? It's like, it's kind of like, what's your spirit animal or something like that, right? Yeah, and you have reverence for that, the actual animal, but also the image of that animal, right? And that animal is then sacred, and it's to be treated in a way that's different than all the other animals if you belong to that tribe, right? And what Durkheim believes, and this is kind of a difficult concept to communicate to people, that so Durkheim's trying to search for the origins of religion, and he makes this argument that what is it that makes us do things that we don't want to do, right? Coerces us, has this power over us that explains things to us that are mysteries, right? And a lot of people would say, God. And Durkheim would agree with that, but he thinks God kind of serves as a symbolic substitute for society, right? It's society and its cultures and its values and norms that compels us to do things that as individuals we wouldn't want to do, right? That explains things like where did we come from? What is the meaning of life? And stuff like that. All these like social constructions and stuff like that were constructed way before we were alive, and we don't have intimate knowledge of those things, right? So Durkheim is making this argument that we use religion as a way of explaining society, as a way of this power that's greater than the individual, right? And in some ways we kind of, misidentify it, right? We don't recognize it as our culture, as our norms and our values that have this power and exert this social control upon us, right? So we attribute it to something like a sacred object or a totem or something like that. And that's, maybe easier to see with Aborigines tribes, maybe harder with our own religion and stuff. But that's the argument that Durkheim makes. Now, he makes that argument in a book that's like that thick, like 600 pages or something like that. And I've tried to summarize it into, about a minute or two, and I probably haven't done real well, right? Another thing that's really important for Durkheim is the use of ritual, like this formal ceremonial behavior, right? When Aborigines tribes would come together and they would worship their totem, right? The frog or whatever the case might be, right? They would whip themselves into frenzy by dancing for hours and hours and hours. And they would achieve this kind of trance state, beating of drums and rhythm and dancing and next to around a fire, so to speak, right? And they would experience this collective state that Durkheim calls collective effervescence. And I've experienced this collective state of being many times in churches, right? And that feeling that we're part of something much greater, right? That things are forcing us to move in concert with other people, right? Like dance does, like ritual does, right? We want to name that feeling. We want to attach it to an object that we can see, right? So we attach it to this totem, right? And this totem, this animal represents the people, right? Oh man, it is a very difficult concept for me to explain without you reading the book. But it's a really interesting idea, right? He's sociologically explaining religion. Now that doesn't mean that religion's not, true or false or anything like that. He really doesn't, as far as I know, have a position on that. But he's describing the role of ritual, and certainly all religions involve ritual. And, the ritual of getting married, the ritual of kids, christenings, the sacrament, the communion, and other religions have others, right? But it's like when you move in concert with other people in coordinated actions, right? When that happens, you tend to lose your sense of that individuality and you become part of the group, right? Yeah. All right. Those are really important ideas by Durkheim, right? And Durkheim also talked about like the major functions of religion. We already talked about this a little bit, right? remember Durkheim's always like super obsessed with this idea of cohesion, unity, solidarity. How all these different groups, we're not just individuals, but we are part of something bigger. Whether that's something bigger, it's like a congregation, a church, society, anything that's, you know. And he believes that of all the different institutions, right, church, state, economy, religion and stuff, education, that it's really religion that provides social cohesion, solidarity, unity, right? It makes us feel like we're part of something bigger, right? Perhaps part of the cosmos, perhaps part of the body of Christ in Christian tradition, right? It makes us feel like that, all this, your brother and your sister, you're not just different, but you're brothers and sisters in Christ and stuff like that. And all this imagery of like God and the church as the body of Christ and stuff like that we're all in this together, so to speak, right? That's us trying to give a name to this feeling of unity, solidarity, and cohesion, right? It's what draws us together, right? And provides the glue of society, right? Now, if you're Durkheim and you see what's happening 1700s and 1800s, and a lot of intellectuals during the 17 or 1800s are saying that we're going to have increasingly secularized society to some point where religion's going to go away, right? And Durkheim's like, no, it's not. It might change, right? But it's not going to go away, right? And even to the extent that its influence is diminished over time, we will suffer because of that, right? Because what happens to a society that lacks unity, solidarity, and cohesion is it experiences enemy, right? People don't know what to do, right? And it might be the case that some religions decline, but other religions adapt to different times too, right? It's not exactly the same religion that was 2,000 years ago, right? Or even 100 years ago, right? All right. So Durkheim's major functions: establishes social cohesion, maintains social cohesion once established too, and then promotes social control, right? It provides a system of sanctions, right? Now, sometimes, like in Christianity, those sanctions, a good bit of them, rewards and punishments are going to come after this life, right? But if people, remember Thomas' theorem, like if situations defined as real are real in their consequences. So that can control people's behavior if they believe they're going to go to heaven or hell or something like that, right? And so that exerts social control upon people. And the last thing, it provides meaning and purpose, right? When you have moments where what am I doing here? Why is this happening to me, right? You wake up and you can't get out of bed and stuff like that. Religion can provide you meaning. Now, there's other sources of meaning as well. But for a lot of people, perhaps for the masses of people, religion does that, right? It provides meaning and purpose. It tells us why we're here and what we're supposed to do, right? And prevents us from falling in kind of nihilistic, like, nothing has any meaning and stuff like that, right? All right. I guess I talk a little bit more about, all right. Let me try to summarize Max Weber's idea on the spirit of capitalism and Protestant work ethic, right? Man, this is all right. So this other fellow, Max Weber, another big sociologist, he's interested in explaining why capitalism really flourishes under Protestant countries and not Catholic countries, right? So, if you look at the countries that industrialize first, and you have capitalism, it really takes off. It's like Germany, England, United States, right? And it's not Greece, Spain, Italy. You have it there. It's not Central America and stuff like that. But it's mostly in these Protestant countries, right? And Max Weber, to really simplify his ideas, believes that that's because of the idea of predestination, right? Which is this idea that before we're born, God knows whether we're going to go to heaven or hell, right? And Calvinists, most Protestants believe this, right? And it causes a great amount of anxiety in us. And we look around at our neighbors and friends, and we look at ourselves like, am I one of these saved or not, right? And there's some quotes in the Bible like you will know them by their fruits, right? Like those who are saved, you will know them because they will live in abundance and be successful and have material goods and stuff like that, right? So this anxiety, it's not that they do things because they think it'll get them in heaven and avoid hell. It's because they do things to reduce this anxiety about whether they're saved or not. It causes Protestant believers to save their money, not spend it, on frivolous things, but reinvest it into their business ventures, right? And that's what is needed really for capitalism to take off, right? Where in other countries, people will make money, but they are less likely to invest it. Instead, what they do is they'll stop working. They'll wake up money and then they'll just stop working, right? They'll stop going to work. You see this in a lot of agrarian. It's like once the harvest is in, everyone goes to the honky tonk or the juke joint. They stay drunk for a month, spend all their money, right? That's not conducive to investments, and that's what you really need, right? But it's the Protestant that has that Protestant work ethic. Even though I've made a lot of money, I'm going to go to work tomorrow and work just as hard, and the day after that, and the day after that. And I'm not going to spend it all on, food and wine and stuff like that, but I'm going to reinvest it, right, in my business so that business can make more and more and get bigger and bigger and bigger, right? So that idea, and you've probably heard of this, the Protestant work ethic before, that's first identified by Max Weber, right? This German sociologist, right? And what he's arguing is that ideas, predestination, theological ideas can affect material conditions. Which countries are the high income countries, and which one are the middle, and which one are the low, right? It can affect who owns most stuff, right? And and who lives in poverty and stuff like that. And that's an idea that comes from religion, right? And it's kind of an argument that he's in an argument with Karl Marx, which Karl Marx does not believe that religion can affect material conditions. So he's in they call it the debate with the ghosts of Marx, right? Karl Marx doesn't think that that's possible, and Weber sets out to prove him wrong, right? That theological ideas can have this effect upon material conditions, right? Yeah. That's the opposite of materialism. That's what we call idealism. This argument that these, ideas have these results on material conditions, right? You know, I guess I'll tell you a little bit about, what a church is, what a sect is, what a cult is, right? A church is a type of religious organization that is well integrated into the larger society, right? A sect is one that kind of stands apart, and a cult is one that is largely outside of a society's cultural traditions, right? UFO cults, what other cults? Oh boy, David Koresh and his followers, right? That's kind of like a counterculture religion, right? Runs counter to mainstream, right? Where churches don't really conflict with mainstream culture, right? Yeah. Let me talk about religiosity, right? Religiosity is a word, right? It's kind of a weird word. Our academics like to make up new words all the time, right? But religiosity is typically measured in surveys by like how often do you attend church, right? Some people go every time the doors are open, 2 or 3 times a week, right? Some people go every weekend. Some people might go like on Easter and that's it, right? Maybe Christmas and Easter. And some people never go, right? And so those are the various kind of, measurements of what we call religiosity, right? Now, religiosity has been declining, right? Not as many people go to church as they used to. Talk to any pastor and they'll tell you about this, right? But, there's something else called spirituality, which is like kind of personal practices, not necessarily through an institution. So you can ask people like, how often do you pray? How often do you meditate? How often, do you believe that there's something greater than yourself, right? And spirituality remains fairly high in our country. It's just the institutional involvement in it is not as high as it used to be, right? And there's a saying, and you might have heard something like, not really religious, but I'm spiritual, right? That means I don't really go to church, belong to an institution, but it has, I believe in something greater than myself, and I believe it's in control of the world, and I pray to it or meditate to it or try to align my behavior and ideas and thinking to that, whatever that power or universe or, So, and there's kind of this rise in like what I call like new age spirituality, right? You don't see a whole lot of this in the South, but if you go to other parts of the country, particularly Hawaii, California, or places in like Taos, New Mexico, or, you go to these gift shops and get your tarot card reading and, buy crystals that are supposed to do something, and they look at your aura and stuff like that. And those are, here in the South, we like kind of old timey religion, but in other places, they have these kind of new age blending of Eastern and Western religions, right? Yeah, so you will see that in other places, not so much in the South. Although, you can see evidence here in the South and stuff like that. All right. I think I'm going to end there. I've been going on about an hour and 10 minutes. It's a lot. I mean, just to cover family and religion and say even some of the things that I believe are important just kind of takes a long time. All right. Make a few comments about kind of, we're getting close to the end of this class. In fact, I think I have one more video to make after this one. Then we're going to have a week where we review. I'll probably post a video kind of trying to tell you guys what I think is most important that we've learned in the semester, and that will help you kind of prepare for the final exam. Yeah, but we are getting close to the end, you know. One more chapter to cover. I'll post a video the week after that, kind of summarizing what I think is most important that you'll need to know for the final exam. And then we'll close up shop and enjoy our summer, right? And yeah, and I'm looking forward to it. Y'all have a nice day.